I was born in the age of Spielberg, or I came of age in the age of Spielberg and Lucas, but I have a soft spot in my heart for the golden age Hollywood westerns and those kind of simple themes of man versus nature and other things. A lot of themes don't play as well in the 21st century, but that's another conversation. Do you think a lot of westerns follow this theme of the frontier thesis and why they were so popular at the time?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a lot of them had some of these ideas, like that there was needed to be a bit of a civilizing force, right? That people came and it was rowdy and perhaps unlawful, and you needed good people of the sheriff or whoever the hero was to come and sort of guide the town back to safety or guide the town to, more civilized morals or democratic morals. But that basic idea, that the frontier was making Americans and forging a nation, I think is in a lot of the Westerns. Even as they're, like Turner himself, ignoring the Native Americans and the fact that this was not an empty Eden, right? There were people there, and people who were often the victim of genocide as the expansion happened. Turner just didn't see that at all. Native Americans are almost invisible from his story, just as they're almost invisible from Bancroft's own story. But in the telling of the Westerns and of, say, the history that Buffalo Bill put together, another contemporary of Turner's, the sort of aggressor and the victim are reversed. It's always the Native Americans attacking the poor settlers, and then Buffalo Bill rides to the rescue, or the sheriff rides to defend the town, or whatever it is. When in fact broadly speaking, the opposite was what was actually happening. So all of those things that are very American were all in those films as well.
All right, well, let's look at the last main figure in your book, Woodrow Wilson, a president that things improved considerably after he had a debilitating stroke. Can't say that about too many presidents, but many would say, and I would agree with Wilson, that's the case. So tell me about him. You're saying that he follows the path of William Gilmore Simms, the idea of Anglo-Saxon race, and there needs to be a caste system based on race. How does Wilson follow this, but then how does he also tweak it for a later period in America?
Woodrow Wilson is a child during the Civil War, and he witnesses Jefferson Davis, after being captured, being marched through his hometown of Augusta, Georgia, to be sent off to trial. And then his family moves to Columbia, South Carolina, where it's a ruin after Sherman has burned it down. And so he's very much a deep Southerner, as his father, like him, was the leading figure in the Confederate Presbyterian Church. Slavery is, of course, gone by then, so it's not about enslavement, but the collapse of Reconstruction in the 1870s had allowed the former Confederate states to reimpose white supremacy backed by both law and vigilante groups. People would be killed if they tried to exercise their rights, or just killed for entertainment sometimes. And he was from a world where that was all the case. And he, in his histories, he basically takes William Gilmore's vision of that ethno-state model, and it's encoded in his own histories and his own telling of the American story. He writes this book, The History of the American People, where he glorifies the Ku Klux Klan and disparages African Americans as not being capable of self-government or having served in the legislature and the Senate or in Congress. And this becomes really important when he becomes president. Many African Americans didn't realize this about him. He had support from some leading African American leaders for his candidacy because they were upset with Teddy Roosevelt's administration and with the way the Republicans had been going. They thought that Woodrow Wilson sounded like he would be giving them a fair deal. Woodrow Wilson said he would give African Americans a fair deal, but in office, he presided over the segregation of the federal government and over the release of Birth of a Nation. So he resegregated the federal government. The government that had won the war, the Civil War, had now been segregated on racial lines. And then he ended up promoting and saving the first Hollywood blockbuster film, The Birth of a Nation, a film which, again, glorified the Ku Klux Klan's reign of terror against African Americans in the South, and a film that had been based on a novel by one of Woodrow Wilson's best buddies and graduate school classmates, Thomas Dixon Jr. And Thomas Dixon Jr. was worried that the film was going to collapse and be a failure and bankrupt him because there were massive protests against the film for its outrageous content. Protests organized often by African Americans in major cities across the country and their allies who were demanding that city and state governments censor the film. And this was at a time when the Supreme Court had yet to rule that artistic products were protected speech under the First Amendment, and cities and states regularly banned theater productions and films that they thought were erode public morals or were not good things for people to see. And there was demands that happen. If that happened in major cities, this film, which had cost huge amounts of money to create, would have failed. And Woodrow Wilson came to the rescue. He actually screened Birth of a Nation at the White House for his cabinet. And then the next day, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court screened it for the other justices and for the leaders of Congress, because the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court had served in the Ku Klux Klan and thought this was all great. This is a time period when the beginnings of the ethos that would create the 1924 Immigration Act was happening, with its race-based quotas specifically and explicitly designed to keep America, an Anglo-Saxon nation of British and Scots-Irish and German settlers, and to prevent the contagion of these other races who were not thought ready for democracy. In other words, Woodrow Wilson is the capstone and the triumphant point of the ethno-nationalist cause and definition of American nationhood, one that had broad consensus across both regions among, the white majorities, and allowed this point of view to become dominant for several decades in our history. It's not an obscure or recessive story of nationhood. It's one that had enormous power and was able to capture and control the national zeitgeist for a long period of time, which is why it's, should not be discounted as a minor danger.
Right. So you would say that the Wilsonian view, it's dismantled at least as a governing apparatus with the Civil Rights Act and the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s. Well, let's talk about modern day implications. And listeners, this is a note to you, especially who've ran out and left 1-star reviews on iTunes because you heard a political view you didn't agree with. Try to keep an open mind and be a good civic nationalist, even if you don't agree with it. So nothing like reading bad reviews on stuff. All right. So in the 21st century, this episode is being recorded in the wake of June 2020 with the protests against the murder of George Floyd. And there's a lot of discussion, and I would say consternation, on both people on the political left and political right of fear of sort of America breaking up. And if I can do justice to both sides, on the left, the idea is systemic racism has existed in the United States with Donald Trump and other figures. There's a militancy that's trying to revert things to an earlier age, and it fundamentally threatens the American project. People on the right would say that with projects like the 1619 Project in the New York Times, which says the entire basis of the United States is systemic racism, the Revolutionary War was fought to preserve slavery, and this has always existed, almost saying that 1776 was a mistake. And by threatening institutions of free speech and other things and the politicization of different forms of government, this fundamentally threatens the American project. So I suppose with your take on how there's never been a unified view, is there good news in this, that America lasted when there wasn't a consensus view, so there doesn't need to be some idea of consensus? Or maybe there's a narrative that we can return to, like Frederick Douglass, that is better? So yeah, what's your take on all this?
Well, I think you're right that people are wondering what holds us together as a nation. The red states and blue and MAGA and Black Lives Matter and these fundamental disagreements over values, who's really an American or eligible to be, over monuments and flags and symbols from our past, over the balance between individual liberty and the common good, all kinds of things in recent years. And now these disagreements have spilled onto the streets. And this is definitely a poignant moment. If we look back, how would we hold the United States together? What do we still have that would bring us together that we could agree on? Can we not agree on at least this, right? And the answer to that, I think, is this. The civic national tradition is the one thing in our background that succeeded in holding us together in a way that is defensible in some form and which has broad consensus and could govern a country that is not Anglo-Saxon and Protestant. That's not even beyond being an immoral way of looking at things, it's not even practically possible to govern in the ethno-state model. So the one path we have forward as we look to see what we can use to rebond ourselves and re-find a shared commitment, a thing that we all agree on, are the elements of the civic national tradition, which is why I think union is really important, because it gives the background to where this all came from and the ingredients, some of which you might choose to keep and some you might choose to get rid of as you create an updated and revised story of our purpose and our identity. But you need to draw on what's already there as you build something new, because as people think about belonging belonging to an abstract thing like a nation, having the legitimacy and the traditions and the longevity of some of these elements is really important to have hope of succeeding in that project. Can one be created? I think it can. Is it inevitable that our country will survive? Absolutely not. This is a real opportunity for us to reinvigorate ourselves, but we need to take it, because if we don't, I think the middle and long-term future for the United States is not a rosy one.
And I mean, something I try to do in the podcast is say that whatever moment we're going through, give context that there's almost nothing that's unprecedented. That's not to say everything will be roses, but with the recent coronavirus, pandemics are not new whatsoever. They are a story older than human history. They are there at the beginning. We've lasted through other pandemics. The situation now, I mean, looking back in the past and thinking of conflicting views of America seeming divided, but then maybe a more optimistic story like civic nationalism versus ethno-nationalism and civic nationalism winning. Are there any moments that stick out in your mind where it seemed like things were going in a bad direction, but then the unifying narrative won out, whether the civil rights movement or other times?
Well, yeah, I mean, in the sort of epilogue to the book, where we carry on after Woodrow Wilson to sort of briefly update what happened thereafter, yeah, that was an enormously powerful moment, because you started with the, sort of white supremacist ethno-national model in the 1920s, and if you fast forward to the 1960s, that's being challenged and overthrown, a resurgence of these, belief that people should be treated equally, that we're equally human and deserve equal rights, and we're not giving them to, these are not being granted to people, and people aren't able to exercise them, and that must change. That was an enormous development, fueled in part and made possible by the deployments in World War II, like I mentioned, but also the struggle of the Cold War, where the leaders of the country who might have tried to avoid and frustrate this attempt, were realizing that the Soviet Union was able to use in our proxy battles in the Cold War in the developing world, in all these different battles for hearts and minds. They were able to point to the fact that non-white people couldn't even find a hotel room and be discriminated against, and couldn't enter restaurants in much of the United States, whereas the Soviet Union would claim that it was race blind and all that. I mean, the Soviet Union had all kinds of horrible things about it, but it was able to win a propaganda war, and all of those things created a moment where this change could be made, an enormous overthrowing of that Wilsonian era consensus. So yeah, that was a very bright point. There are other bright points in history that have happened. I was in Eastern Europe in 1989 when communism collapsed, and the sense of hope and possibility, not only among the East Europeans I was living among, but everywhere in the world, across Europe and the West. It almost brings tears to your eyes to remember how that felt when it seemed possible that a better world was going to be built, and how quickly it would collapse in the siege of Sarajevo and the Western reaction to it, and all the events that have happened since. So yes, there are these poignant moments that happen, and which can give us hope. But also, things often don't turn out very well in the medium or longer term, and we should be sober and aware of that as well. The Black Death was not a good thing for Europe, even though Europe carried on later.
Very true, very true. So, well, this is really timely, and there's a lot more to delve into, and I recommend listeners who want to hear a lot more of the story look for Colin's new book, Union: The Struggle to Forge the Story of the United States Nationhood. Colin, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
There you have it. That is all for today's episode. Once again, I want to start things off by thanking the Spy Masters of History Unplugged. I'll explain what that is in a second. Our illustrious Spy Masters include Baron Fraser, Chris C., David Santee, Josh from VFW Post 2285, Jake Harrington, Jennifer French Lee, Josh Reddick, Michael from New York, Michael Piccinetti, Nick Brooks, Rob from Chicago, Ryan Gillen, Salvador Sanchez, Tom from Ohio, Moondoggy from Ohio, Bill Ivey, and Wire Meets Wood Guitars at WMWGuitars.com. If you'd like to support the show, there's some very easy ways to do so. First, go to the site halfpricehistory.com. I've worked out an arrangement with a lot of the authors who've appeared on this show, and you can go there and get their books for 50% off. All you have to do is go to halfpricehistory.com and enter the promo code UNPLUGGED at checkout.